For our lesson this week, we're going back to a concept we did one of the first weeks we were apart from each other in solving quadratics. Now, one of the ways that we had already taught you how to solve a quadratic is to solve a quadratic by factoring. Okay, so that's what we're going to do first. I'm going to be given the quadratic x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0. If I'm asking you to solve it by factoring, you do a couple of things. One, you always make sure it's set equal to 0. We're good. Then we set up and solve an x puzzle like we did for factoring. In this x puzzle, you need an a, a b, and a c. A times c goes in the top, b goes in the bottom, and a's are underneath. As per usual, we look for numbers that multiply to the top number and add to the bottom. These numbers would be 6 and negative 1, because 6 times negative 1 is negative 6, and 6 plus negative 1 is 5. We play a reducing game, and we get that the factored form of this polynomial, of this quadratic, is x plus 6, x minus 1. Okay? If you remember back to that lesson that we did, if we have the factors and we want the solutions, all that we have to do is change the signs. So these are the factors, which means that the solutions are x equals negative 6 and x equal 1. Because those are the opposites of the factored form. That's what we did a couple weeks ago, solving quadratics by factoring. Now, let's try this next problem. Let's try 3x squared minus 2x minus 7 equals 0. Again, I want to solve by factor. It's set equal to 0, so I'm ready to start. I look for an a, a b, and a c so that I can set up and solve my own x puzzle. A times c goes in the top, that would be negative 21. B goes in the bottom, and the a is underneath. Now, if I look at this problem and I make a list of numbers that multiply to 21, this is the only thing on the list. Is there any way I can combine 1 and 21 and 3 and 7 so that this x puzzle works? No, like neither of them make negative 2 if I add or subtract them together. So we're like, okay, this is weird. Normally we would answer not factorable. So if I was looking for you to solve this, we're not even able to factor it. So I wouldn't be able to solve it. Thus gets us to our important, very, very important formula that we're going to be using today. This is called the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is a foolproof method, which means that if you are trying to solve a quadratic equation ever, if I ever ask you to solve it, you can always use this method. It will always work. Okay? For the ones that can't be factored, we do need to end up using the quadratic formula. If you like the quadratic formula better, you don't have to solve by factoring anymore. You can use the quadratic formula to solve any of your quadratics. 100% it works every time. Here's the quadratic formula. It's a little complicated. It is on your green piece of paper, which has been uploaded to a Google folder and in your Google Drive for you. But it is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. It is a very complicated formula. But the nice thing is that it is on your formula chart and you can always write it down and use it on your quiz and notes. All you have to do is plug in the a's, the b's, and the c's that we've been finding from the quadratic equation to begin with anyways. Now this formula is really fun to sing. If you want to sing it, it actually goes to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. I'll sing it once for you. Normally in class I make you sing along. I will not do that since we are not in class. But here's how the song goes. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay? So, lots of things happening, but when we have, just like that quadratic that didn't work a second ago, 3x squared minus 2x minus 7. We can still find an a, b, and a c. That's the only things that you have to plug into this very complicated formula. So if we're going to plug this in, we'd plug it in as x equals the opposite of b. Well, b is a negative 2, so I'm going to put the opposite of negative 2. It's complicated, just stay with me. The next symbol is a plus or a minus, which means we're going to have to do this problem twice. One time with the plus sign, and the second time with the minus sign. Square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times whatever a is. Again, all I have done is taken the numbers that are a, b, and c and plug them into the equation exactly where they belong. This is the opposite of b, so I put b right here. This is b squared, so I put b right here. Minus 4a, a, c, c, all over 2 times a. You're just plugging it in. Once you've done the first step of just plugging it in, you turn to a calculator, or in this case Desmos, since that's the calculator you have at home, and you're going to allow Desmos to do the math for you. So we go to Desmos. We're going to type x equals, and we're going to start off with making that giant fraction bar, because it's easier to do the fraction bar first. We're going to type in exactly what was on our notes a second ago. So exactly what we wrote down, without the a, b, and c, but with your numbers in there, we're going to write down. So we have negative, parentheses, negative 2, and then we had the plus or minus symbol. I'm going to start with the plus. Square root, if you remember from last week, if you wanted to type it into a computer, you'd do SQRT and it changes it to a square root. B squared minus 4 times A times C, go to the bottom, all over 2 times A. Man, that's a lot. But if you notice, the moment I finish typing it in, it spits out an answer for me. Right here. Here's a really ugly decimal that is the solution, one of the two solutions for this quadratic. We are going to ask you to round your answers, so if you need help rounding, you can just click on Desmos where it crosses the x-axis, since that's the same thing as a solution, and see the rounded number to the nearest thousandth. Now if you remember, we're not finished, because this is just the plus sign. We also need the minus sign. To make my life easier, I'm going to go to the settings tool, and I'm going to copy or duplicate this equation. Cool. And instead of a plus sign, I'm just going to change that to a minus sign. And now I have my second solution. This is also going to be rounded for you to the thousandths place, which is what we're asking for on the graph itself. Okay, so quickly we're going to write down those solutions for this problem. We're going to say that x is approximately negative 1.230 and that x is approximately 1.897 as it is rounded for me on the graph. If I wanted to round the numbers to the nearest thousandths, that's what I would get as well. So if we look, oh, you can't see because my face is in the way. There we go. If you look, this right here, these approximations or these roundings are the solutions. Just like we found with the factoring, where they're the opposite of the factored form, when it's not factorable, there are going to be some decimals like this. Again, this quadratic formula works every single time you want to solve a quadratic. Okay, you're going to need to be using a calculator for this. Desmos is a calculator, so that's where you're going to go. We're going to do a few more examples of the quadratic formula, and then I'm going to have just some examples written for you on the screen without me talking through them for you to just see more examples. But let's go ahead and we're going to solve the following using the quadratic formula. So we want to solve using the quadratic formula. If you need to go back to the video and write down that equation for you, it is on your formula chart. If you don't have a formula chart, you need to be writing it down. Here's the quadratic we're going to be solving. We've got x squared minus 10x plus 24 equals 0. Before we solve, we always check that it's in standard form. It says equals 0, and it's in alphabetical order. This is awesome. We need to know the a, the b, and the c. A is 1, b is negative 10, and c is 24. In which case, all I have to do is fill out the funky equation. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so here we go. X equals the opposite of b, so negative negative 10, plus or minus, that's two different problems, the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. All you're doing is dragging and dropping, basically taking the numbers from a, b, and c and plopping them in where they belong. One thing you might notice that I'm doing is using a ton of parentheses. You need to use a ton of parentheses. Every single piece that you plug in should be in parentheses. Okay, now that we've plugged it in, all we need to do is calculate what it is. So we pop over to our calculator and we start typing these numbers in. Get rid of this. We have x equals, and I start with the fraction. I'm getting the fraction by pressing the backslash button underneath the question mark for those of you using a regular keyboard. We have negative negative 10. I'm going to start with plus. Square root is sqrt. Negative 10 squared, all in parentheses, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. This time, it actually gave me a nice, pretty number. That's because this equation is actually factorable. We could have done this the old way, but we're practicing factored form. Okay? Can't see because my face is in the way, but it also gave me that point here on the graph. It's one of my solutions, so it's one of my rocks words. We copy this, duplicate it, and we change the plus sign to a minus sign. So we need to do both. There are two solutions. This one also comes out to a nice pretty 4. That's okay. So we would know, back on our paper here, that since we calculated this in Desmos, our x's would be equal to 6 and x equal to 4. Now, this is how I'm writing it here, but when you're typing it in on your Google form for Check for Understanding, it's going to ask you to list them from least to greatest. So you would just answer 4 space 6. No comma, no nothing in between them, just 4 space 6 or 6 space 4. That's how you would write your answer on your Google form. Okay, we'll do one more example before you just have the ones to look at. We're going to go to this one. Again, I want us to solve using the quadratic formula. Here's the quadratic that we're going to solve. We have x squared minus 4x plus 1 equal to 0. First thing we do is we check that it's set equal to 0 so that it's in standard form. It is. If it weren't, you'd have to move the piece using inverse operations to make sure that it says equals 0. We find an A, a B, and a C. For this particular problem, A is going to be 1, B is going to be negative 4, and C is going to be 1. Then we have to fill out our fun and funky equation. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's start plugging things in. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b, lots of parentheses, squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Cool. We've got it all plugged in. We're ready to calculate using Desmos. Get rid of this. And we start with x equals and a fraction. X equals the opposite of b plus, because I have to choose one of them, sqrt for square root, b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. It's got an ugly decimal, and if I were afraid that I was going to round this wrong to the nearest thousandths, which means I keep 3 decimals, I check on the graph to make sure that it is rounded correctly for me, the way I'm asking for the thousands. But not finished, that's one solution. Quadratics normally have 2 solutions. So we need to check also the minus. Plus or minus means that we have to do both, and now we have 2 decimals correctly rounded that we can use as our answer. We'd say that x is approximately 0.268 and x is approximately 3.732. Now looking back at our notes here, again, to put these numbers in on the forms the way we're asking you to, you would just list them 0.268 space 3.732. That's from least to greatest, so the smaller number goes first and then the bigger number. Now I'm going to stop talking through some problems, but I am going to show you a few problems that are completely worked out so you can see them. So that's what's going to happen. Sorry, the dogs are barking. This is going to happen in the next slide. Please hold. It's a completely worked through example for you. If you were asked to solve using the quadratic formula this quadratic, where we have a of 1, b of 34, and c of 289, we would still fill out my quadratic formula with b, a, c, and a, exactly as it says in the formula. And I'd throw it into Desmos. I'd calculate both the plus and the minus version of it. This particular problem, when you do the plus and the minus, both of the times it comes out to negative 17. That's totally possible for it to happen. This is called a repeated root. It's not really something you need to know till next year, but since there's a number, it makes sense for it to be called a repeated root. When you have a repeated root, you only have to answer one time. You don't have to say negative 17, negative 17. You would just say one of them, just negative 17, as a solution. One more example that you get to see. If you need to see more examples of me doing problems using the quadratic formula, go ahead and message me on Remind or your teacher on Remind and let them know that you need more help, or just rewind the video and see it again. But just remember, you can do it. Alright, we miss you guys. We empower, we impact, we love. We are Skeeter Nation.